First of all, thank you guys so much for all coming to the session. I really do appreciate you coming. I also appreciate the graduate school for giving me this opportunity to talk about something I've always thought is important and interesting, and that we should be talking about in the humanities and social sciences. So, just to introduce myself, my name is Shoei Mikkel. That's my pronunciation, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm currently a second year master's student in the Communication and Rhetorical Studies department. I see some folks in my department in here. Appreciate you guys. Um, and my primary interest is in immigration rhetoric. So I've always been interested in understanding like my history and my own past, right, and my culture. And so a route of that is through my study, which is immigration rhetoric. I'd be happy to talk about it with anyone if you ever want to talk about it. I'd love to. Um, Currently, I'm also a TA in the department. I've taught 3 courses, which is Foundations of Communication, Public Advocacy, and Presidential Speaking. But prior to graduate school, I actually worked in corporate for 2 years. And I ended up in renewable energy and the STEM world. My undergraduate degrees were both in the humanities and social sciences. I was a communication study and psychology major. And so when I told my students this, my first semester, I got an influx of questions from them about how I was able to pivot my degree to get a job in the humanity, like after the humanities and social sciences. And so I thought about it and I realized no one was having these conversations, at least in my undergraduate institution, about how we can use these degrees to get a job. And a part of this is a gatekeeping process that I want to address in the workshop today. But also a part of it is, a lot of us don't have that knowledge, especially if we've been in academia for so long. And so the purpose of this workshop is to have a dialogue and start beginning understanding in our own pedagogy as teaching assistants and as graduate students in general who are interested in going into pedagogy, right, as a long-term endeavor, how we can integrate these conversations right now and kind of remove this general stigma around the humanities and social sciences. I mean, generally, right, I still experience the same questions, and I'm sure some of you do, right? Of what the hell are you going to do with this degree, right? And a part of that is because we're not having these conversations about how we can pivot and use some of this to actually get a job. And a part of this also as graduate students or PhD students who want to go into academia is kind of being honest and real with ourselves that a lot of our students won't end up in academia, right? They are doing this to get a job. And that is the elephant in the room that we're not discussing, right? Especially in the humanities and social sciences. So I hope this workshop will begin to have that dialogue, not only with yourself, with the professors that you're working under, and your own teaching style and how to integrate conversations about professional development and how to use the humanities and social sciences to get a job. If anyone has questions throughout this workshop, please put them in the chat. I'm happy to talk about it. Or if there's any comments that you have, it'd be much appreciated. I would like to have this to be a very much a dialogue between you guys and the knowledge base that you bring in, because I understand that I don't know everything. And so I'd be happy to integrate some of the knowledge that you all have into this presentation as well. So that's a little bit about me and where I come from and why I'm doing this workshop. Actually, over the TA orientation earlier this August, I had put a little bit of this together and the graduate school was nice enough to ask me to expand on it. So that's the mission here. All right, so what is this workshop about? What are the objectives? We're going to discuss how the humanities and social sciences can result in tangible skills in the job market and how we can talk about this in our classes as TAs. Removing the gatekeeping involved in knowledge about breaking into the workforce, not only just in the private sector, but also in academia too. How we can be a resource for students who also want to go into academia, or if we have our own knowledge base and backgrounds, right, in corporate or outside of graduate school, how we can more incorporate that into our pedagogy, because our students are looking to go into the workforce after they graduate, a majority of them. So that's generally what the objectives of this workshop will be. So just an agenda so we can walk through it. I'll be going into the saliency of this topic. Why is this important? Integrating tools and skills into our pedagogy is the next thing that I'll be talking about. And I will talk about my own experience after a year of integrating some of this knowledge that I'm talking about and integrating it into my own pedagogy and what it's done and what it's resulted in. And then I also want to end with a discussion. There isn't too many of us in here, and I think it'd be great to hear from some of you on your own comments about integrating this into your own pedagogy. And then lastly, a Q&A. Sound good? Awesome. Okay, so I want to start off with a quote that I had seen a little bit ago, and you'll guess who this is from. But this is generally about the stigma that we hear around the humanities and social sciences and professional development. So this quote says the following: "A lot of young people no longer see the trades and skilled manufacturing as a viable career, but I promise you folks can make a lot more potentially with skilled manufacturing on the trades than they might with an art history degree. Now, nothing wrong with an art history degree. I love art history, so I don't want to get a bunch of emails from everybody. I'm just saying you can make a really good living and have a great career without getting a 4-year college education, as long as you get the skills and training that you need." Does anyone recall who this quote was from, or maybe know? It made quite a little bit of hubbub when this individual said this. No. So, oh, Maria, please.
Was this Obama?
We can't hear you.
You can hear me now.
Still can't hear you. Yeah, you can type it in the chat. Please do. Does anyone else have any guesses? Oh, it's in the chat. You are absolutely right, Maria. You're right. So, former President Barack Obama actually said this quote in Wisconsin when he went to a rally to talk to folks who are blue collar workers. And when he said this quote, it actually made quite a hubbub, and we can imagine why. And this is in no way denigrating folks who do blue collar work or trade skills like that in any way. But it was interesting that he made this metaphorical comparison, right, of art history degrees and getting hard labor skill jobs. Does anyone know what Barack Obama got his undergraduate degree in? Political science, which is a social science, right? And he's president of the United States, so or was. So it's definitely possible. But this is generally touching on a stigma, right, that we hear, especially when we're in popular culture and culturally, right, about what getting a degree in the humanities and social sciences looks like. The reason why I bring up this quote is because the way the Department of Education, right, and in general, how the state governments handle funding for humanities and social sciences is impacted by things like this, the stigma, right? If we're hearing folks of authority, of positions of power, generally saying, hey, this thing is worthless and you can't get a job, that has repercussions in terms of funding, which we'll talk about, and why we see this stigma, but also generally discourages folks from pursuing those degrees when it's not true. Like, it's definitely possible to have transferable skills and find a job. You may even become president. So there you go. All right, so let's talk about why there's generally a stigma around job availability and the arts, humanities, and social sciences. I'm going to say AHSS. That is the term that I'm familiar with. So folks aren't confused, I'm referring to the arts, humanities, and social sciences in that acronym. But generally, in the last 15 years, there's been a major shift in the amount of students who actually do enroll and decide to be humanities and social sciences major, primarily due to the 2008 financial crisis. So let's look at this chart, which was done by The Atlantic, and this is data that they gathered from the Department of Education. So let's talk about what we see on this chart. I'm not sure, I think everyone can speak. I hope that's not turned off in the settings. But let's generally talk about the trends that we're seeing in this chart. So just offhand, folks, what do you see in terms of the trends temporally? Yeah. So Seth, I see you pointing down. There's a steep decline. Yeah, a steep decline. and it hits right after 2008. Um, some other things to note, though, that's really interesting in looking at this information from the Department of Education and a lot of the other data that we gather about the humanities. So if you look to your right, there's only a few disciplines there, right? So we see languages and literature, philosophy, religion, history, and English. Something that's really interesting that I've learned is a lot of the times the data that they're gathering on the humanities and social sciences actually only includes philosophy, history, and English, which of course are a part of the humanities and social sciences. But we know in the last 30 to 40 years, we've seen a shift, right? Departments like Chicano studies have popped up, Indigenous studies, African American studies have popped up. And it's very interesting to see that the data ignores those in terms of the humanities and social sciences, right? But we see in 2008 that there's a major shift and decline that is going and going and going down in the last even 2 years. And predominantly that's because after the 2008 financial crisis, folks were worried about job stability. And the STEM fields give you more of a linear idea of what you can go into after a 4-year bachelor's degree, right? If I have an accounting degree, I'm probably going to go get an accounting job. Same thing with engineering or any other STEM or business major. And so we saw after folks saw the recession hit, there was a concern about job availability. And this is where we see a major shift in the amount of students that are enrolling in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. And this is because predominantly of a stigma that you can't get a job out after undergrad, right? And so the repercussions of this are real in many ways. And I want to touch on this because it's the elephant in the room. It's also about student retention, right? In our own disciplines, it's important to get students enrolling because it's also about funding and making sure that these studies that I hold dear to my heart, right? Things that we are all studying in our own disciplines can continue. And a function of that is making sure and retaining students and also getting folks enrolled in your disciplines in all reality, right? And so this is generally where we're seeing, at least in the last 15 years, the stigma coming from after a major like historical event like a recession. Okay, so I want to talk about and show you guys this TED Talk really quickly that has really interesting insights in terms of funding and the statistics around the Department of Education and how this individual used folks who came out of the humanities to actually pivot them in the tech field. And so I want to look at this and have a discussion, about the statistics that he's talking about in terms of the Department of Education and funding in general, where it's shifted in the last 10 years in the humanities and social sciences, as well as just talk about contextually what he means. The reason why I'm talking about a lot of this data and I want to address this and is to give you guys context as to why we should even integrate this into our pedagogy as TAs or as folks going into academia long term. So if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and play it. I'm going to stop him there because I actually disagree with some points, but I actually think some of the points that he made regarding funding is actually really interesting. So what are some of the claims that the speaker is making in terms of pivoting his own recruiting in his own tech company that he works for, in shifting that recruiting to focusing on STEM to rather opening it up to larger audiences? What is he claiming are the benefits that he's seen? You can put it in the chat too. I'm okay with that. Yeah.
It feels like he's saying that sometimes like engineers all look at things in the same way, and so having like some creativity from people who might have more soft skills can be very successful.
Yes, and I will talk about emphasizing soft skills in our own pedagogy too. So great point. Thank you, Seth.
Okay, I believe he's talking about the fact that you can actually have humanities kind of solution to complex technical issues. and he is he thinks there's the need to focus more also, focus equally on the humanities than just having everything on the STEM.
Right, right. Thinking about how we can, there's more nuance in problem solving, right, than purely looking at analytical skills that involve maths and sciences. Yeah, correct. And then Maria said in the chat that an increase in tech companies is not a direct link to presumed increase in tech/STEM specific jobs. Exactly, right? So we're seeing a major shift in our own economy and job availability to certain fields that doesn't necessarily necessitate that folks have to have a STEM degree. And so that's what he was emphasizing in his change and how he now recruits engineers for his own tech company, excuse me. So just in general, and I would prefer this to be in the chat as a thinking exercise, but what career prep did you see as an undergrad within the classroom? I'm not saying things that the university did under their career development departments, right? Or outside of the discipline itself. What were career prep that you actually saw as an undergraduate? I will speak from my own experience. Again, I was a humanities student. I did comm and psychology, and I didn't have any discussions in the classroom about how to pivot any of the things I was learning into something, into something that could be a tangible skill in the workforce. And that required me to do my own work outside of it. And that's predominantly what happens for students. Oh, I see that someone said something in the chat. Yeah, nothing. There isn't a discussion. There isn't. And it's unfortunate because what that happens is it's contributing to that same stigma where like it lets it grow. And so we as TAs have this unique opportunity, or folks who decide to go into academia and teaching, we have a unique opportunity to try to integrate and bring up this novel conversation in the humanities and social sciences that just isn't prevalent. I don't think I received any career prep in any class beyond saying when you get a job. Right. So we lack this. And so this is just emphasizing the same thing that I was talking about. But why is this? Right. So predominantly career prep in the classroom has been predominantly in community colleges and high school education. And the reason for this, right, is because faculty tend to have deep but narrow focuses in their experience in the workforce, right? So most of the faculty that we interact with and the folks we work with who are teaching only have experience in academia, which is still very useful. That's a discussion you can also have with your students. And I will get to that in a later slide. But the reason for that is they just genuinely don't have the knowledge. So what do we do if you don't have the direct experience of working in corporate or something in the private sector before you went into academia, let's say, or you didn't make that pivot? What do we now do if we don't have that education or experience, which I will delve into. So before I do that, though, I also want to talk about why this is prevalent even throughout PhDs. So I'm pulling this from a really great book that I will show you guys the title to at the end in my citations. But there's generally a major gap in data and conversations about what people do post-grad with even having PhDs who don't end up in academia. So actually, and this is another thing that we can talk about in terms of the Department of Education, but there's a major gap in data because the survey of doctoral recipients discontinued 25 years ago on longitudinal studies of what people do with their humanities degrees. So there's virtually no data on PhDs who decide not to go into academia, and almost similar to bachelor students. And so this is a gap we're also seeing that's also adding to the stigma. If we're not seeing data of where folks were successful with humanities and social sciences degrees, of course, you're skeptical of it being possible. And so it's also attributed to that same gap in data we're seeing on a federal level. And I also talked about this. I want to emphasize this in the slide specifically. The practicality of translating classroom content into job prep is, in a real sense, for folks who want to stay in academia, is also about classroom retention, student retention, and funding, which I touched on before. This is something I know at least the chair, one of the old chairs in my department is very honest about how some departments don't get student retention and therefore lose funding. Or I know in VPA, there's only one or two disciplines in there that are making money, and that puts them at risk, right, for losing certain departments. So I want to talk about who we're failing when we do this, when we're not talking about uh, job prep or career prep outside of the humanities and social sciences. So who do we predominantly fail? A large group of students that we fail in not having these discussions is first generation college students, folks who don't have the background or positionality to have the information to know what to do with their degrees after undergrad. So I'm pulling this from a 2012 study that looked at this. Um, they kind of associated this idea of not having job prep or conversations in the humanities and social sciences about what students can do with their degrees on independence, having to figure things on your own, paving one's own path, in quotes. And they generally found, which is not shocking, that it rendered academic tasks difficult and thereby undermined first generation students' performance. And so when they found that there was interdependence, so having a community to talk about these things, this is what we're generally trying to cultivate, right, in the classroom if we're having these conversations with our students. Um, they found that it eliminated the sense of difficulty and didn't have adverse consequences for these first generation students. So if we're thinking as educators, right, on the positionality of our students and where they come from, having this conversation and also giving them the skills in the classroom to try to translate this into job skills, and also even having conversations on how to break into academia, because that's something we all have experience in, right? Having those conversations is in that same way breaking this kind of difficulty that they saw and undermine first generation students' performance. So I just thought that was an interesting note to make if we're thinking about ourselves holistically as educators for students of many different backgrounds. Okay, so within pedagogy, so like what do we do now? I gave you all the context. How can you integrate this into your own teaching? So it's really kind of emphasizing to students that the humanities can be taken seriously, and it's done through a number of ways. Seth brought this up, this idea of soft skills, right? So if anyone would like to say in the chat, what is something we traditionally think of as hard skills? One of them is writing, right? Writing, math, for example, hard skills of things that are very much teachable. Soft skills, on the other hand, are things like empathy, mannerism, politeness, tone with folks. That's generally what soft skills are. In my discipline, which I can speak for, which is communication and rhetorical studies, we do that through teaching speech, right? Teaching them how to change their tone, things of that nature. In my lectures for those courses, I usually add, why is this important? Because I can see, and I'll be honest with myself in this, and I will get to this as well, is sometimes these courses are taken as blow off courses, right? That's a large experience I've had with my own students and my experience as an undergraduate. And so emphasizing on how we can, the exact lesson that I'm working on actually touches on skills that I learned and used has been exceptionally helpful. So I usually include a slide or a discussion within my courses of an example from my own corporate life that I actually use some of the content that I'm learning for. So for my own speech classes, I'll talk about a presentation I did in the energy world for an audience that I was not a part of. I'm not an engineer. But because of the skills that I learned in the classroom, I was able to translate that for my corporate job. And so I often bring up how those soft skills help me in my own professional development in the world outside of academia. But if you don't have that skill set or that background, I'll talk about some other things that you can do within your own pedagogy to integrate this. Another thing that I emphasize a lot is, I'm very sorry, it's loud in the background, if you guys can hear that. I live very close to like a fire department. One thing that I also emphasize to students is this idea of communication literacy and critical thinking. As that TED Talk kind of touched on in his own interpretation of how he's changed his own job recruitment, one thing he's looking for is folks who think critically on different levels. Now, of course, the STEM is teaching folks how to critically think, but there are two forms of critical thinking here. And so emphasizing to students what that is really helpful in your discipline. So for me, it's communication literacy. How can you actually analyze the texts and messages that you receive in the world holistically? And that's useful when you're working. It's very useful. Another thing that I want to touch on is within this pedagogy and incorporating this. This was a piece of advice I got from Professor Loretta Master at ASU, which was exceptionally helpful when thinking about this and integrating it into my own pedagogy, is also setting expectations for yourself and integrating this into your own courses that you're teaching. So what do I mean by that? I think it's also understanding and being real with yourself that there might be a number of students who won't see the value in it regardless, but still doing that work because there still is a percentage of folks who will find it extremely helpful. Another thing that I recommend is adjusting lesson plans based on real life scenarios. What do I mean by that? So I'm touching on the same story I kind of brought up earlier. I often bring up my experiences in corporate and looking for a job outside of academia with a humanities degree, often in my lesson plans, as well as any real world issues that are popping up in terms of the job market and what it looks like. I feel like often it's just the elephant in the room that we're not touching on, but we have the ability to bring up this dialogue with our students. All right, so what does this look like? There's a few things that I do. So I speak about my own postgraduate experience, being honest with our students and yourself. A majority of these students won't be going into academia, and actually touching on that is helpful. So usually every semester in my courses, I do set aside a recitation. In the past when I was teaching recitations, or in like the class I'm teaching now, or I'm fully teaching it, I do actually set aside one class to talk about career development with the specific degree. One thing that a lot of us have in common with our students is we were there not that long ago, or at some point in the same exact discipline and degree, right? And so it's been helpful, and I've gotten great feedback from students just setting aside that time to talk about genuine concerns they have about the job market, and also with their degree. So I actually do recommend setting up a time where you can have these conversations with students if you have that knowledge. But what if you don't have that knowledge? Leaning into guest speakers or subject matter experts is really helpful. I know in our department, they do keep in touch with the alumni of the program, and are happy to connect you with them. Like Maria knows, for example, in our newsletter that we write, we reach out to those alumni quite frequently. And so even getting their advice or an ability to integrate them into one of your lessons about having these conversations, I think is very useful, especially for alumni who recently graduated. Leaning into guest speakers. And also a really nice thing that we have as graduate students is we have each other. A lot of us do come from backgrounds where we didn't come out straight from academia. We were in another job field. And so using that knowledge and asking even your fellow TAs or PhD candidates, whatever, about their own experiences post-grad, I think is really helpful in having this conversation with your students and what they did. Additionally, right, I'm recognizing my own positionality, and that also affects how I went into the job market and what I did. So getting a much more integrated view from other students in your department or even faculty who might have experience, I think is very helpful. My first semester, I actually did have a student who said, thanks, I actually don't hear a lot of Black women talking about their experience of finding like postgraduate jobs in the humanities and social sciences and their own experience in corporate. And so the fact that I had that positionality was helpful, but I also recognize that not all of us will have that. And so reaching out across the table to folks in your own department, I think is a great way to set aside this time to have this dialogue with students. Lastly, in terms of your own pedagogy, really talking about how transferable these skills are. I will notice when there's a lull in the lecture where things are, people are like, why does this matter? Which is valid. But I try to take that time to say, hey, this is what I mean by this, and this is how it's transferable within the real world or the job market. And I found it really helpful when I was interviewing, for example, or I found it really helpful in terms of when I was writing emails in corporate world, right? I didn't have to change or shift a major way of understanding that I had. And so honestly emphasizing that quite frequently in your lessons, and maybe even setting aside at the end of the class, talking about how this is transferable, is helpful. Because I know in our own disciplines, we can get bogged down with theory, which of course has its place and is important. But we also have to relate that to our students in some way where they feel like they can associate it with the real world, or at least help them make that connection. So therefore, it's helpful for them when trying to understand how I'm learning here is actually useful for me to get a job. Does that all make sense? Awesome. All right, some other things. I talked about setting aside time and resources, but I also actually recommend having a conversation about their anxieties in terms of finding a degree in art humanities, with an art humanities and social sciences degree. So in the beginning of my teaching life here at SU, I actually had a session where students would talk about it. And I think it's quite cathartic for them, especially being someone who just left that job field only a year ago. It was quite reassuring for them to at least have someone with that experience. And this means that some of you guys might have to find, right, and do that research to make those connections for students. But I found it helpful because, again, this isn't a conversation that really academics have in the classroom. And so at least having that time is important. Also, being frank about the stigma. I'm honest with my students if I'm saying, I understand that this can be understood as a blow off course or this content material, but my objective is to show you how to do A, B, and C because it is helpful in the real world, especially when marketing yourself and finding a job. I'm honest about my own journey, and I also encourage my students to pursue professional development outside of the classroom, which is internships and then consulting and connecting them with alumni. Um, One thing that I didn't think that my students would care about was they wanted me to walk through my old resume and why I made some of the choices that I did. I just asked them, is that something you'd be interested in? And they really were. And they asked me about the internships that I had on my resume and how it helped me find that corporate job and how some of the skills I got there transferred into the classroom. Of course, not everybody has that knowledge base, right? If you didn't do those internships or careers, but again, connecting them to folks or at least tools to do that is really helpful. Um, and also, again, as I said, consulting your department on alum that they can connect with, who would be happy to speak would be helpful. I know in our own department, last semester I took a class where the professor actually asked every 2 weeks an old alum who didn't end up in academia, and I'm in a master's program, right, to come speak to us about how they found a job and where they pivoted. And I found that extremely helpful. Um, so doing things like that, setting aside the time, I think is quite important and helpful in terms of making these connections for students. All right, so let's do like a discussion activity a little bit of kind of decompressing everything that I talked about and how you see yourself applying this to your own pedagogy. So something I really like in my own discipline is something called critical self-portraiture, where we're reflexive about our own experiences, right, and our positionalities in terms of what we're writing and working on in terms of publishing. But let's think about it in terms of the content and the subject matter that we're talking about today. So how do you see yourself integrating this depending on your discipline, right? I know there's folks from all over the place in here. How do you see yourself emphasizing some of these tangible skills? Do you see any? And what are some challenges that you see in general? You can do the chat too if you're having difficulty with the audio.
My audio working?
Yeah, good. We can't hear you, Maria. Oh no.
What?
Oh, someone else gonna speak?
Hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. You can go. Okay. Um, Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on. I haven't used Zoom like at all this semester. Like it was consistent every single day last year, and so like I was always up to date, and now I just apparently I'm not capable of using Zoom.
I get it.
But um something that I think is or that I've tried to do, and I actually haven't really gotten much feedback on this. Like, I've asked some students, and it's kind of been like, oh yeah, like I think it was helpful, and it's kind of hard to judge sometimes, like if that's a genuine answer. They're just kind of like trying to be nice or
Mm.
whatever. But within different classes, like there are kind of standard basic assignments that I feel like you can kind of tweak in a way that can be helpful. So I was having a really hard time um, trying to like connect presentational speaking with kind of like how you could use this in your career. Like it on a really basic level, it makes sense, and you can be like, oh, you're going to have to present things and give speeches and stuff like that in your job potentially. But like sometimes students want more than that. So I kind of like try and repurpose not re- yeah I'll say repurpose some assignments um that will like be transferable to their job, or something that they can take away as like practice prepping for a job. So one of the assignments in presentational speaking that we give to the students is an elevator speech. So I've kind of changed my elevator impromptu speech a little bit in the way that I want my students to uh, think of something that they want. So a job, an internship, um, a scholarship, something like that. Like
Mm.
everybody has something that they want individually. And so then essentially to deliver that elevator speech and to like, sell yourself to that position or the person you'd be talking to. So like to be able to condense down into a minute, what are the skills that are actually useful? What is past experience that I have that like how can I transform what I've done into something that will get me what I want? And then I have like the other students kind of talk about it afterwards, like,
Mm.
acting as um, the person who might hire them, so like an employer or something like that, and kind of about like, yeah, I thought it was really good that you included how, you can use your past experience doing this or this internship, and how it will work for this job. So I think the very long way of saying that like there are kind of like those standard assignments, especially if you're teaching a course that's like public speaking, intro to writing, one of those kind of more basic level courses. You can take like kind of more standard assignments that the students need to do, but transform them a little creatively in a way that can like directly link to like, look, this, you can
Mm.
literally take this exact assignment, maybe tweak two parts of it, and then this can be your resume, this can be your like um your recorded interview introduction or something like that. um, so that's something that I found helpful, because I do think it is very difficult sometimes to like be able to show your students how those skills will be transferable.
Yeah, you brought up an excellent point, which is adjusting our lessons or like assignments that we're required to do from our professors who like lead us, right? And having a discussion with them of saying, hey, I would like to shift this lesson a little bit to something I wish I had seen as an undergrad or I found useful in terms of finding a job or making this transferable. So, yeah, like changing up assignments is a great way to try to show students this is tangible in literal ways. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Seth. I think you're the last.
Yeah, hi. So I am in a weird position this semester. I'm teaching a graduate course for engineers on public speaking. So everyone in my class is a PhD student, and I'm a master's student, and they're all studying electrical engineering, or excuse me, yeah, electrical engineering or computer science, both of which I am woefully unqualified to teach them about. And so it's been challenging trying to find like what skills I have that would be useful for them. And so what I've done is I've thought back to my time in the workforce and what things I was trained on when I first started like an office job. And then I'm bringing that training into the classroom. So one of the assignments that I have in the class is my students need to send me 4 professional emails throughout the semester, which is still a challenge somehow.
Mm.
So, like teaching them like email etiquette and things like this, like, if you send a really long email, things like lists or like bold text can be really useful. And also, like talking to them about how not everyone that you interact with in the field is going to be an engineer, right? You're going to interact
Mm.
with people in the marketing department or people in the finance department or people in HR. And you need to not treat them like they're dumb because they don't have an MA or a PhD in your field, right? And so working on those skills has been really useful. But um, I took your advice. Spoiler alert: Shawit and I are roommates, so we talk quite a
We are.
bit. But when you talked about bringing in people who are already in the field or like experts, I did that, and so actually on Monday I have a Zoom panel for my students of people who are currently in the field doing engineering work, but also people who graduated with degrees like mine in communication, and how they operate in the field and how they see engineers and any advice that they have for engineers that's not from engineers, which I think is going to be really useful. So anyway, I've taken your advice. My students are very excited about it. So I just want to echo what you said. I think it's useful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Anyone else, maybe in any other disciplines or departments that sees challenges in integrating something like this in pedagogy? Okay, well, regardless, you can always reach out to me later and I'd love to hear about it.
I just,
Oh, go ahead.
can I go ahead?
No, I wasn't going to say anything of importance. Go ahead.
Okay, I kind of had the challenge too of, I have my outline for my students, and I didn't really know I could tweak that a bit to add something out of the outline. So it's more like the challenge for me is that I've been teaching on the straight jacket thing, following the outline, trying not to discuss anything out of the outline, apart from asking the students how they are doing, hope they're well and fine. Do they have challenges that they want to talk about? I didn't really know that, I could actually incorporate these aspects into my teaching. So I think I probably will have to have a little discussion with my professor to see if it's acceptable by him,
Mm.
if I can go on with that.
Mm. Yeah, so having a discussion with the faculty member who's advising you or is the lead of the course, if you can even have these conversations, especially since, yeah, for a lot of us, depending on who you're TAing for, they have stricter guidelines than others about what they want to happen in the classroom. But you're actually bringing up a great point that this could also be a resource that we provide our students in office hours, because I know as TAs that we're required to do that too. And I'd be happy if more people showed up to my office hours, in all honesty. So yeah, you're bringing up a great point. What if the faculty member that's advising you is like, hell no, about integrating this into the classroom? And so, yeah, office hours is another great way to show students that you're available to them as a resource in this matter. And maybe just setting aside time in class to say that, hey, I would love to talk to you about how you can pivot this, or if you have concerns about finding a job in this degree or even discipline, if that's something they want to do. And being available to them in office hours is also something that is, I think, a great tool. but you brought up a great point. Thank you. Any other comments? All right, so I think we are wrapping it up. So I just want to say thank you for everyone who registered for this workshop. I really appreciate it. I hope there's some information and content for you that was new and that you can integrate into your own pedagogy as TAs. If anyone is on LinkedIn, I'd be happy to connect on LinkedIn. If we're talking about professional development here, you know, why not? So that's my name and my email if you ever want to reach out. I'd be happy to talk about this and my own experience, or if you even want me to talk about my own experience of working in corporate and then deciding to go to grad school, I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, you would like the slides? Yeah, for sure. Can I do that, Sean? Can I send you the slides to pass along, or?
Yeah, you could send me the presentation and I can email it to everyone who's registered or everyone who's in attendance. Or you might be able to drop a copy of it into the chat.
Oh yeah, that's true. I can do that right now. Yeah, I can do that for you right now. There you go. Any other questions? Well, I will wrap it up there. I really appreciate all of you registering for this and sitting here and listening to me talk for an hour. Please do connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love to connect that way. And otherwise, I wish you guys a great rest of your semester and journey in trying to integrate something like this into your own pedagogy.